Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. So in the last episode, we had a look at why are there anachronisms in the Book of Mormon? Things or animals which are out of time and place. If the Book of Mormon is historical and is a translation of an ancient text, why would there be anachronisms in it? We looked at anachronisms such as horses, elephants, steel, cattle, goats, pigs, and silk, and metals. We also had a look at some other anachronisms like churches and Jesus Christ. So critics would say that these anachronisms show up in the Book of Mormon because the Book of Mormon is a 19th century text and that these things were absent from Mesoamerica during Book of Mormon times. Apologists state that there's been less and less anachronisms over time, and there's also been some discoveries of things like barley, cement, and metal plates that were once considered an anachronism and then later turned out not to be. And that we've only excavated less than 1% of Mesoamerican archaeological sites, meaning that we haven't discovered everything there is to find. Apologists also argue that some anachronisms may be the cause of a lone shift, so perhaps the Nephite calling a new unfamiliar animal the name of something else, or a translator's anachronism. So in today's episode, we're going to be looking at, is there any archaeological evidence for the Book of Mormon? So apologists or believers would say yes, and critics would say no. So who are you going to believe? So in this video, I'll try to represent the critics' position when it comes to archaeological evidence or lack of it, and also point to what apologists or believers, faithful scholars, would say is some of the strongest evidence or convergences, correlations supporting Book of Mormon historicity. So things between Old World geography, Mesoamerican geography, and the text of the Book of Mormon. So some of the main sources that I'll be taking from for this video will be Book of Mormon Central, Brant Gardner's book, The Book of Mormon is History. And if you want to find out more, go check out my episodes with him. I'll also be borrowing from Larry Saint's Q&A, who has a really good episode on Book of Mormon Evidences. And LDS Truth Claims has a really good series on the Book of Mormon, as well as many other sources. Okay, so I want to start off with a quote from Sandra Tanner, who is a prominent critic of the church. And this is what she has to say about Book of Mormon and historicity.
I grew up in a time when you had Mormons that really believed that Mormonism was actually true and provable. I, as a young Mormon having questions, looking at the Book of Mormon, I assumed there were really artifacts, that there were languages, that there were people and maps and all those things to back up the Book of Mormon. And it's when I seriously started looking at it that I realized, no, this is not a historical document. If it's not a historical document, God didn't write it because it claims that He is the author of it. So if the Book of Mormon is not true, then Joseph Smith made it up, then there's no truth to Mormonism. Because they can't come up with answers about archaeology and the languages and the people group and all that. So they've had to shift the argument. So the emphasis now is on, let's be positive. It's a way of diverting people from serious discussion.
So Sandra is saying that the Book of Mormon is not historical, and there's also been a shift among believing members, moving away from claiming that the Book of Mormon is history, trying to divert away from these discussions. And while the church would hold back and have no official position on Book of Mormon geography, it hasn't moved away or changed its view, believing that the Book of Mormon is historical, and neither have faithful scholars, although there may be some who may hold to it being inspired fiction. So critics would state that there's no archaeological evidence or proof to support the Book of Mormon's historicity and authenticity. They would say there is no credible archaeological evidence to support the notion that the Book of Mormon is a record of highly literate ancient American people of Hebrew descent. Most scholars reject the idea of viewing the Book of Mormon as a historical record. Michael Coe, a respected Mesoamerican archaeologist from Yale, says, "As far as I know, there is not one professionally trained archaeologist who is not a Mormon who sees any scientific justification for believing the foregoing." And critics might ask, if massive civilizations of highly advanced Nephites and Lamanites existed, why would all of the evidence mysteriously disappear? Coe, who's the late Mesoamerican archaeologist and expert on Mesoamerica and the Maya, he had to say this: "The bare facts of the matter are that nothing, absolutely nothing, has even shown up in any New World excavation which would suggest to a dispassionate observer that the Book of Mormon, as claimed by Joseph Smith, is a historical document relating to the history of early migrants to our hemisphere." And the Smithsonian Institute has to say, Smithsonian archaeologists see no direct connection between the archaeology of the New World and the subject matter of the Book of Mormon. So critics and non-LDS archaeologists would say that there's no definitive archaeological evidence that supports the Book of Mormon's historicity, at least not in the New World. And this might seem pretty devastating to the Book of Mormon's historical claims. However, let's address some assumptions that critics or members may have about the Book of Mormon. So one, that the Nephites and the Lamanites were the only peoples here and that they spread across the entire continent, that the Nephites and the Lamanites spoke in a form of Hebrew and that we should see evidence of Hebrew writing across the Americas. 3, that we should see Christian iconography in the Americas if the Nephites were historical. And 4, that we should expect to see names of the Nephite cities. Okay, so I discussed in my DNA episode and also with scholars Frank Gardner and Ugo Prego concerning the Nephites and the Lamanites being the only peoples here and they filled the entire continent. And we discussed in those episodes how there are implicit references to other people being here. We know that there were from science, and as scholars have critically looked at the distances traveled in the Book of Mormon, it points to more limited geography, and that they very much would have been absorbed into the culture. So if there were already peoples here, civilizations here with their own language, it's very unlikely that the Nephites and Lamanites would have been speaking in the language they brought with them, Hebrew, but they would have adopted the surrounding languages. And as time passed, Mosiah says that he kept his sons trained in the language of their fathers, implying that this was not the language they were speaking. However, linguistic scholar Brian Stubbs has pointed to Uzo-Aztecan language going from Mexico to Utah and it having some connections to Hebrew. So perhaps there could have been some form of Hebrew language among the early Mesoamericans. So Christian or Hebrew iconography is another assumption we would expect to see, which we might expect to see if Israelites migrated over and they were the only peoples here. But what's most likely is that they would have adopted the culture and the iconography of the people there. And that much Christian iconography was actually borrowed from other cultures, pagans and such. So it's very much you borrow the iconography of the people in your surrounding culture. And number 4, looking at names of cities. And according to Mesoamerican archaeologist Mark Wright, that we don't know the names of most ancient American cities. And also, I think it's important to bear in mind that less than 1% of archaeological sites in Mesoamerica have been excavated. And the difficulty in determining certain artifacts which have been discovered, for example, a city, a house, a pot, how do you decipher, how do you determine if it's a Nephi artifact, a Mayan artifact? How would we distinguish between the two? John Clark, who is a Mesoamerican archaeologist, says that we've uncovered Book of Mormon artifacts, but they are masked as Olmec or Maya, and that we have a lack of written text in the New World. And the Maya and the Olmec are names and labels that modern archaeologists have given them as one civilization. However, they weren't one civilization, weren't one single culture or nation, but separate nations. Another important point to make is that many events in the Bible also haven't been discovered archaeologically. For example, there's not been any evidence of the Exodus of Moses and the children of Israel fleeing from Egypt, traveling through the wilderness. So sometimes Christians can hold the Book of Mormon and Book of Mormon archaeology to a different standard, realizing that there's some problems as well for the Bible. I also think a lot of this discussion with regards to archaeological evidence, there's a little bit of subjectivity in here. As in, what do you mean by archaeological evidence? Are you looking for things which are plausible, things which converge between, say, Old World geography and the Book of Mormon? Are you looking for definitive proof, like welcome to Zarahemla, and an inscription that says Nephi was here? So I think it's important to recognize that different people will have a different spectrum of what they determine as archaeological evidence. For some people, they'll want absolute proof. For other people, it may be, is there some plausible correlations? So in this video, I will be focused on what I have found to be probably the most plausible and strongest correlations, convergences, and evidence to support the historicity of the Book of Mormon. And the majority of the evidences that I will be presenting, I've not seen critics really deal with or respond to, so I won't be engaging too much with what the critics have to say. But the critics' position, I think, very much is that there's no definitive archaeological evidence, no non-LDS archaeologists who would support the Book of Mormon. They would probably state that all of these convergences that I'll be pointing to are either just coincidence or luck, or that the apologists are making a stronger case than what they really are. However, I still think they need to be taken into account. We shouldn't just ignore evidence because of our predetermined conclusions. and we should approach this with an open mind. Now, a couple of quotes from church leaders with regards to evidence or trying to prove the Book of Mormon. Elder Dalnius Joke says, "It is our position that secular evidence can neither prove nor disprove the authenticity of the Book of Mormon." And Elder Neil A. Maxwell said in his book, Plain and Precious Things, "It is the author's opinion that all the scriptures, including the Book of Mormon, will remain in the realm of faith. Science will not be able to prove or disprove Holy Writ. However, enough plausible evidence will come forth to prevent scoffers from having a field day, but not enough to remove the requirement of faith. Believers must be patient during such unfolding." So this video is not going to be providing this is definitive proof, although some people may find some of the evidence quite strong to support, but it's really going to be looking at, is there some plausible evidence, and are there any convergences between what we know between the Old World, the New World, and the text of the Book of Mormon. So let's start with Old World geography. In the opening chapters of the Book of Mormon, Lehi and his family depart from Jerusalem around 587 BC, right before when Jerusalem is going to be destroyed by the Babylonians. Lehi's travel through the Arabian desert and name locations line up very well with Old World geography and archaeology. After leaving Jerusalem and reaching the borders of the Red Sea, they traveled for 3 more days until they camped by the Valley of Lemuel, which Lehi described as a continually running river through a firm, steadfast, and immovable valley before emptying out into the Red Sea, with grain, fruit, and seeds. There is a valley matching the description quite well, Wadi Taib al-Asim, which is a good candidate for the location, especially because it contains the only known stream which flows continually into the Red Sea, as Lehi states. They travel for 4 days in a south-southeast direction towards Shazer to hunt. There is a plausible location with an oasis and hunting grounds. They continued their journey in the same southeast direction, sticking to the most fertile parts, and then the more fertile parts along the frankincense trail. Nephi's steel bow breaks. However, the translation of steel bow is likely a brass-covered wooden bow, as it is in the Bible, which would coincide with them moving into a hot, arid climate, which would cause the wood in the bow to twist and break, resulting in Nephi having to make a new bow with new arrows, which would probably require a different type of arrow. So they traveled in a southeastern direction towards a place called Nahom. So notice they're naming all these places as they are on their journey, but they say they came to a place which was called Nahom, and they buried Ishmael there, and his daughters mourned his passing. Nahom in Hebrew means to mourn, and researchers in the late 90s noticed the letters NHM engraved on an altar in Yemen, dating to before Lehi's time. The Semitic script on the altar, like Hebrew, doesn't contain vowels, so Lehi's Nahom could correlate with the inscription on the altar Nehem, and the vowels A and O as a Hebrew pun, meaning to mourn. They're in the right location, and you could say NHM on an altar may just be a coincidence. So Nahom appears to be in the right location and at the right time, and they've even found the name Ishmael at Nahom, it being a burial site, which also would fit the description of why they would bury Ishmael there. Now, a lot of critics scoff at Nahom, and you could say this is just a coincidence, but it's strengthened and supported by its geographical location and the directions to Bountiful. In the Book of Mormon, it says they traveled nearly eastward until they reached a place called Bountiful. The main incense trail turns east also, which Joseph Smith would not have known. And there is, on the coast of Arabia, a couple of possible locations for Bountiful. One location, Coriantumr, nicely matches with Nephi's Bountiful. Unibly stressed as early as 1950 that this is not a place which we called Nahom, but the place which was called. Unlike the other campsites named in the text, this one already had a name, which Lehi's group could logically only have learned by talking with local people. And Terrell Given said that Nahom is found in the very area where Nephi's record locates Nahom. These altars may thus be said to constitute the first actual archaeological evidence for the historicity of the Book of Mormon. So supporting this convergence of Nahom dating to the right time, being in the right location, and having the right consonants, and it being a burial site, and then finding the name Ishmael, is supported and strengthened the convergence of Lehi's travel through the Arabian desert, and then the correlation to Bountiful. Many people have wondered if such a coastal paradise existed in the Arabian Peninsula, and some early critics scoffed at the thought of a lush oasis existing in the coast of Arabia. Consistent with Nephi's description, Coriantumr is the most fertile coastal location on the Arabian Peninsula, with abundant freshwater, large trees, fruit, and vegetation. Its natural resources satisfy Nephi's description of much fruit and wild honey, as well as the need for substantial timber to build a ship. Carthage also features a prominent mountain, with steep cliffs from which Nephi's brother could have menacingly threatened to throw him into the depths of the sea. Geological surveys have discovered that smeltable ore lay practically exposed at the surface of the earth in Carthage and nearby locations. Now, critics might push back on Nahom, Bountiful, and the strong convergences of Lehi's travel through the Arabian desert constituting archaeological evidence. So critics might push back, saying that the inscription on the altar, NHM, could be transliterated to Nahom, but since we don't know what vowels were supposed to be used, any other vowel permutation is equally likely, such as Nahum, Naham, and so on. And the only existing pronunciation for NHM is not Nahom. It was most likely called Nahim or Nahem, not Nahom. And they state that the inscription is most probably a tribal name, not merely a location. So are we supposed to believe the pronunciation was changed from Nahim to Nahom? So my response to this would be that this is most likely a Hebrew pun, and it talks about in the text that the daughters of Ishmael did mourn exceedingly over their father. So it was likely put in by the author. And Neil Rapley claims that the name Ishmael has been found. However, I don't think there's any way that we can verify if it's the right Ishmael or not. Critics may also suggest that the name likely came from similar names from the Bible, and that it's just all likely a coincidence. If the LDS apologists can believe that the NHM evidence is too significant to be just a coincidence, then how do we justify the fact that many names in the Book of Mormon seem to correspond to maps of the local region that Joseph grew up, indicating that he just made up the names in the Book of Mormon? So my pushback would be to Vernal Hawley's map, which some critics have pointed to being perhaps inspiration for where Joseph Smith, that he got the cities and locations in the Book of Mormon from his surrounding area, that many of the cities in his map didn't exist in 1830. And many were named after, so Joseph Smith couldn't have borrowed from them. And it's probably more likely that many of those names, like Jerusalem, would have just been taken from the Bible. And some of the names as well aren't even that similar. So I personally don't think describing Nahom and Bountiful being the same as the Vernal Hawley's map, because it doesn't even match the geography of the Book of Mormon. Whereas when we look at the Old World Convergences, Lehi's travels through the Arabian desert, following the incense trail, them coming to a place in Yemen called Nahom, with an inscription NHM, it being a burial site, Naho being the Hebrew word to mourn, and then them traveling in an eastward direction towards Bountiful. It all correlates in time and location together. Scholar Eugene England said, for Joseph Smith to have so well succeeded in producing over 20 unique details in the description of an ancient travel route of one of the least known areas of the world, all of which have been subsequently verified, requires extraordinary, unreasonable faith in his natural genius or his ability to guess right in direct opposition to the prevailing knowledge of his time. Of course, any particular detail might be coincidental, and I do not claim that such things as distances traveled can be exactly proven, but the piling up of parallel detail after detail with no contradictions is conclusive. And I'll grant that I don't see that Nahom and Bountiful Lehi's travel through the Arabian desert as this is direct proof, this is a bullseye, proving that the Book of Mormon is historical. However, I do think that it converges together pretty well, and it's plausible evidence to support that maybe this might have been an ancient travel that Lehi and his family went on. I actually found the convergences so strong right before I came back to the church that I thought that Joseph Smith must have had a map of the Arabian desert, because to me, I didn't know how to make sense of how well it paralleled. However, you can choose to just say it was just coincidence. However, even if one does not see it as strong evidence to prove or strong evidence in favor, the Book of Mormon is at least not inconsistent with Old World geography and the Arabian deserts. And perhaps a question to ask is, what realistically would you expect there to be better evidence in the Old World to support? What proof would you need? Would we realistically expect for them to be writing their names? Nephi was here. So to me, Lehi's travel through the Arabian desert, Nahom and Bountiful converges really well, and it's evidence that needs to be taken into account. However, you could just dismiss it and say, okay, maybe there's some things in Old World geography, but is there anything in the New World which correlates with the Book of Mormon. So first of all, we don't know exactly where the Book of Mormon took place. The church has no official position on Book of Mormon geography. There's some people who believe it happened in North America, in the Heartland region. I think most faithful scholars would lean towards Mesoamerica being the best fit. So I'm going to be working off that position of John Sorensen's geographical model for the Book of Mormon and see if there can be any correlations in geography or with the times, history, culture between the Book of Mormon and Mesoamerica. I want to start off with this quote about the Native Americans. In Joseph's day, Native Americans were believed to be savage, barbaric, and uncivilized, not dwelling in large cities. People didn't believe in Joseph's day that they inhabited large and sophisticated cities, but lived in scattered villages. David Whitmer even said after the vision of the angel in the gold plate, when we were first told to publish our statement, we felt sure the people would not believe it, for the Book of Mormon told of a people who were refined and dwelt in large cities. But the Lord told us that he would make it known to the people, and people should discover the ruins of the lost cities and abundant evidence of the truth of what is written in the book. And large cities, civilizations, and ruins have been discovered, and there's been some recent findings with LIDAR technology. So LIDAR technology has sent billions of laser beams down, penetrating through the jungle canopy, bouncing off and seeing structures and ruins below, creating 3D images of the data collected. Some of the things LIDAR has discovered which aligns with the Book of Mormon geographical descriptions include the Maya being a vast, dense, and complex civilization, massive population size of 15 to 20 million, 65,000 previously unknown structures, highways and elevated highways, large-scale agriculture, public works, dams, canals, and ditches, animal pens and domesticated animals, prevalent warfare, fortresses, defensive walls and fortifications, and endemic warfare over centuries, especially 250 to 500 AD. While none of the findings of LIDAR technology can definitely prove the Book of Mormon, some of the things that we're finding out about Mesoamerica are correlating some of the descriptions of the geography and the landscape spoken of in the Book of Mormon. And I think LIDAR technology as well is a reminder that we don't know everything there is to know, and with more discoveries and with advancing technology, there's more to find. We're finding out more about the Maya and their civilizations and vast cities, and that there's more and more that we're learning, and there's a growing body of evidence. And many of these things that we're finding, Joseph Smith would not have known in his day. There wouldn't have been this scholarship or this archaeology of the Maya and Mesoamerica. Okay, so let's talk about some specific convergences. I want to talk about Mulek. The Book of Mormon tells us of one of King Zedekiah's sons who was named Mulek, that he escaped and came to the New World. The Bible says that Zedekiah and his sons were killed by Nebuchadnezzar II during the Babylonian captivity. There's no mention of anyone named Mulek in the Bible. So we learn separately from the Book of Mormon is that there is one that escaped. A stamped seal of a royal figure was found in the 1980s by archaeologists digging in Jerusalem. It's dated to the exact time of Zedekiah, and it's written in Paleo-Hebrew, and it calls the royal figure Malchiah, son of the king, which would have been Zedekiah as of that date. One of the shortened Hebrew variants of this name would be Mulek. Book of Mormon Central says Malchiah from the stamped seal, Malchiah from Jeremiah 38 verse 6, and Mulek from the Book of Mormon are derived from the same ancient Hebrew root MLK. They show up in the same time period, and they are the sons of a king. It is therefore reasonable to conclude that they might very well refer to the same individual, and that that individual's father was indeed King Zedekiah. Very interesting. Okay, so Coriantumr stone. Coriantumr, who was the last king of the Jaredites in Zarahemla, in Omni 1 verse 20 we read about, and it came to pass in the days of Mosiah that there was a large stone brought unto him with engravings on it. Mesoamerica is unique in the Western Hemisphere for its writings. Part of that tradition includes inscriptions on stelae or on large stones. By 400 BC, stelae typically focused on a king or ruler, depicting him as a warrior, providing a record of his actions, and listing off the ruler's ancestors. These details are broadly consistent with a brief description given in Omni 1 verse 20 through 22. Before the 1960s, most scholars believed the Mesoamerican monuments had no historical content whatsoever, but exclusively depicted and described gods and myths. Yet the Book of Mormon describes a large stone engraved with the history of a king, his battles, his ancestors, and the origins of his ruling lineage. Appreciate how unknown this practice was in Joseph Smith's own time, and the fact that it took 130 to 160 years for linguists and epigraphers to catch up with Amaleki's description in Omni 1, verse 20 through 22. Okay, and now we're going to talk specifically about the convergences between the Book of Mormon and Mayan culture and Mesoamerican geography. John Clark has to say this about comparing the Nephites and the Lamanites and the Jaredites to the Olmec and the Mayan. While the geography of the Book of Mormon is not known with certainty, the correspondences between the Book of Mormon and cycles of Mesoamerica civilizations are striking. It would be a mistake to assume that the Jaredites are the Olmec and that the Nephites and Lamanites are the Maya. Rather, the consistency in their cycles of civilizations suggests that the Jaredite and Nephite history could have unfolded within the broader context of Mesoamerican history. And Brent Gardner would say that the Jaredites and the Nephites and the Lamanites, rather than them being the Olmec and the Maya, that they participated and were part of the Olmec and Maya civilization and culture. So rather than looking for archaeological evidence to prove the Book of Mormon based on perhaps our assumptions, another question to look at is, well, how well does the text of the Book of Mormon, how well does it fit, align, and correlate with what we know about Mesoamerican geography, the civilizations, the history, and the culture? And I would highly recommend Brent Gardner's book, The Book of Mormon as History, and check out our conversation where we go in more depth talking about the convergences between Mesoamerica and the Book of Mormon. But I'm going to go through some in this video. So Brent, in an article, he addresses the criticism of those people who say that they'll only believe in the Book of Mormon if non-LDS archaeologists support and verify it. He says, I have people who write to me and say, we would like to have you recommend a lot of books to us written by non-Mormons on archaeology and the Book of Mormon, which sustain the Book of Mormon. He writes back and says, I can't recommend a lot of books to you written by non-Mormons, which sustain the Book of Mormon. The archaeologists find archaeological evidences and write their books. Some of us Mormons have gleaned the appropriate evidence from the archaeological books and correlate them with the Book of Mormon to sustain the ancient Nephite records. The non-Mormon, however, hasn't been interested in doing such a thing, and perhaps will not be. Don't expect him to write a book like that for you. Don't be so wishful in your thinking, naive in your thinking, because such does not exist. So while some people may want a non-LDS archaeologist to write a book and to verify the Book of Mormon, the reality is, why would a non-LDS or a non-religious archaeologist or scientist write a book about archaeological evidence to support the Book of Mormon or any other religious text or claim? They're just going to be writing about archaeology. It is really only going to be those who are either believing faithful scholars in a religious text or in a religious tradition, or critics who will then use the scholarship presented to either support or to disprove. And what many Latter-day Saints and what many critics want is that one piece of definitive archaeological evidence that settles the case. For example, a city which says, this is welcome to Zarahemla, or Nephi or Mormon was here. First of all, I personally don't believe that God is going to provide proof for it, just as I don't believe that he's going to prove that Jesus resurrected for the parting of the Red Sea, the gold plates are real, or where the Book of Mormon geography happened. I don't think God is in the business of proving. However, I also don't believe he'll want it to look like an obvious fraud and people to believe against all reason and all evidence, but that there is plausible evidence to still maintain faith, because then everyone would be forced or coerced or compelled to believe rather than being free to choose to have faith or not. And also, if we find something that just said Zarahemla or ZHML, I think that could easily just be another Nahom, and if nothing else fit in Mesoamerica, then it'd be very easy to say, yeah, it's probably just a coincidence if there's nothing else that fits. However, I think the plausibility and the correlations between Mesoamerican geography and Mayan culture almost can make as much of a compelling case. So rather than looking for the one definitive proof, I think it's good to let's look at the plausible correlations and convergences between the Book of Mormon and what we know about Mesoamerican geography, scholarship, and Mayan culture. Gardner also clears up in his book that some of the past LDS scholarship perhaps has not helped us, pointing to the stela known as the Tree of Life stone and the story of the Mesoamerican great white god Quetzalcoatl. That these things cited by Mormons in the past in Mesoamerica to support the Book of Mormon is poor scholarship, and they are not credible correlations. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the correlations and convergences. So not long after the Nephites arrive, the people are desirous to have Nephi as a king. A possible explanation in time and place in the surrounding region in Mesoamerica sees the emergence of Maya kingship and reflects a surge in kings from small communities to cities with kings. Thus, the Nephites wanting Nephi to be their king fits with the Mesoamerican context in time and location. Mosiah fleeing the land of Nephi to Zarahemla in 200 BC. So it doesn't say why Mosiah and his people fled, but we know the Lamanites took over. It's plausible it could have been from a massive incursion into highland Guatemala, which is Nephi in John Sorensen's model. It appears that right when the Book of Mormon tells us that Mosiah I and those who would follow him left the city to Zarahemla, secular history tells us of an invasion that also resulted in the flight of those people who lived in that area. And if Sorensen is correct in associating Kamanalajuhu with the city of Nephi, I totally butchered how you pronounce that. That is one of the specific places mentioned from which the Exodus occurred. And also when the Nephites fled to the land of Zarahemla and met the Mulekites, when the two peoples met, Amaleki indicated that the Zarahemlite language had become corrupted, and they had brought no records with them, and they denied the being of their creator, and Mosiah or the people of Mosiah could not understand them. Mesoamerican scholars state the Olmec were a single language of two daughter languages, Mixay and Zoque. There is a separation of Mixay and Zoque around 500 BC. The language of the peoples living in where Sorensen places Zarahemla was Zoque. Thus the Mulekites would have lost their language. The Nephites being Cholan speaking. Thus we have a convergence in time and place where peoples in Mesoamerica merged together, spoke different languages, and would have been mutually unintelligible. This correlation between the Zoque speaking Olmec and the Mayan speaking Cholan and their migration to that location connects in time and location with the Book of Mormon. Okay, costly apparel and having many wives and concubines in Jacob chapter 2. Mayan scholars point to, in Mayan communities, people were trading in goods and wearing their jewelry and exotic materials to display their wealth. This links to Jacob rebuking the Nephites for wearing costly apparel and being puffed up in pride. During that period, around 500-550 BC, having larger families, including wives, meant that you could produce and manufacture more goods to trade and obtain more wealth, which is something which occurred in that time and place among the Maya. Nephite wealth was built on trade with neighboring communities, where successful traders practiced polygamy. Thus, polygyny would be accepted as marriage according to the regional law, but not according to Nephite law. So placing Jacob's sermon in a Mesoamerican context during the time period in which Jacob gave this sermon supplies the reason that social inequality and polygyny should not only both appear in his sermon, but both be linked together. Thus, Jacob rebuking the Nephites for pride, wearing costly apparel, and the practice of polygamy is consistent with what was occurring in that time and place in Mesoamerica. Okay, let's talk a little about Maya warfare and how that correlates with the Book of Mormon. So the myth of the Maya was that they were a peaceful people ruled by serene priest astronomers. The Book of Mormon's chapters on warfare reflect the type of warfare the Mayas engaged in, including weapons, fortifications, armor, and the seasons of warfare. The Book of Mormon speaks of the Lamanites casting stones and throwing arrows at the Nephites. This casting of stones and slings was a common weapon of the Maya, because we would think of, a bow and arrow that you shoot an arrow, you don't throw it. But a weapon that the Maya used was I'm going to pronounce this wrong, atatl, which is a spear or arrow thrower. So thus talking about the Nephites and the Lamanites throwing arrows is something that actually occurred in Mesoamerica at that time. The sword spoken of in the Book of Mormon was likely the makwatil, constructed from a long staff or large paddle-shaped piece of wood with sharp obsidian flakes, which were fixed into the edges of the wooden blade, giving it a deadly cutting edge. The story of Ammon's battle at the waters of Sebus demonstrates that the cutting edge of the Book of Mormon's sword was capable of severing arms. The cutting power of the obsidian edge of the makwatil was renowned at the time of the Spanish conquest. Thus, Ammon cutting off human arms would have been easily possible for a man armed with a makwatil sword. Another interesting correlation to the makwatil is when the anti-Nephi Lehis talk about staining their swords no more with the blood of their brethren. Wooden swords inset with rows of obsidian chips, as was the makwatil type, would have become stained by blood soaking into the wood. Had their swords been made of metal, the metaphor would have lost its power. Okay, let's talk about fortifications. The Book of Mormon says that around 75 BC, the Nephites in the land of Zarahemla engaged in digging up heaps of earth round about all the cities, throughout all the land which was possessed by the Nephites. Of the 375 fortified sites documented in Mesoamerica, some 200 had definite defensive features, while 100 others were listed as possibly fortified. Archaeology confirms the textual description of fortifications in the right time and place in Mesoamerica. Cortez described a Mayan fortification in 1525, the whole town being surrounded by a deep moat with wooden palisades and heavy swords and heavy boards built above the height of man, with large towers to hurl their stones on the enemy. This very closely matches the fortifications described in the Book of Mormon. The war chapters speak of the Nephites digging up ridges of earth too high for the Lamanites to have cast their stones and arrows, raising up of timbers and earth to an exceeding height, up to the height of man, and towers to be erected so that the stones could not reach them, and that they could cast their stones from the top. So the description of the Nephite fortifications matches very closely with some of the fortifications which have been found among the Maya at the time of the Spanish conquest. What about armor in the Book of Mormon? There are 8 distinct terms for armor mentioned in the Book of Mormon: breastplate, shields, armor, headplates, arm shields, animal skins, thick clothing, and bucklers. So how does the system of Nephite armor compare with the armor used in pre-classic Mesoamerica? Mesoamerican scholars support that just as in the Book of Mormon, the most common material used for armor among the Maya and the Aztecs was a thick fabric or animal skins. The most basic form of armor was a thick, sleeveless shirt made of cotton or of other woven material. And this picture depicts a Maya warrior and the correspondences between the armor of the Nephites and that of the ancient Maya. But the seasons of warfare. So Nephite wars were typically carried out early in the dry season, which would have been like winter period or around like the new year, permitted by the agricultural maintenance pattern and when weather conditions were most suited for military campaigns. The Nephite seasonality pattern for warfare agrees remarkably well with what we know from Mesoamerica about seasons for fighting and for cultivation and harvest. The Book of Mormon manifests clear parallels to ancient patterns of military behavior. In none of these topics does the Book of Mormon contradict the ancient patterns of the practice of warfare. In many of these topics, the Book of Mormon uniquely reflects its heritage of Mesoamerica. Unibly is called the study of military affairs in the Book of Mormon, a rigorous test to the historical claims of the book. The Book of Mormon does indeed pass the test. Other Mesoamerican convergences include the mention of paying tribute to a king. Mayan kings would take over peoples and ask for a tribute, such as Limhi and his people who paid tribute to the Lamanite king. The Maya also had kings and smaller kings or rulers in their kingdom, and this correlates with King Lamoni's father being the king over all of the land, while other kings having smaller kingdoms under his jurisdiction. Now, this fits very well into the Mesoamerican time and context. Another convergence is when King Lamoni and Ammon go to visit another king to persuade them to let go to release Ammon's brethren. The term royal visit may be defined as the peaceful visit of one lord to the city of another. Although instances of royal visits were only sporadically recorded, they were no doubt a common occurrence among the classic Maya. All facets of the story, the formal visit to another city and the expectation of a king's obeisance to the overking fit very comfortably into a Mesoamerican context. Okay, and what about the destruction of the Nephites? So to set the scene, we begin with Mormon's observation that the whole land had become covered with buildings. The people were as numerous almost as it were the sands of the sea. Also in a previous video, I talked about how Mormon describes the Gadiantans, that they went to a land northward of many waters, that they built buildings of cement, that there's a lot of deforestation there, and that there is a place in Mesoamerican Teotihuacan which matches in the right location and description with the Gadiantans. And Gardner argues that the civilization of Teotihuacan represent the Gadiantans in the Book of Mormon. The archaeological record for early classic Mesoamerica agrees that there were an increasing number of people in the Maya world along with an increasing number of new cities. At this point in Mesoamerican history, the ties between Teotihuacan in central Mexico and the Maya civilizations to the south of the Nephite holdings were stronger than ever before. This increased Teotihuacano presence in the Maya heartlands gave both the Maya and the Teotihuacan a strong motive to secure the trade route that ran along Nephite territory. The desire for control of the Maya markets may have finally reached the point that a war of destruction became cost-effective. Charles W. Golden suggests an all-out destruction of the enemy may be expensive in the short term, but reduce the need for warfare in the long term by eliminating threats to royal power. Teotihuacan is in the central basin of Mexico. Tikal is in the Maya lowlands, some 800 miles away along modern roads. Between those two major powers were the Nephites, by this time somewhere around the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, and therefore potentially controlling trade routes between the north and the south. Perhaps that was not to be tolerated, with an increase in trade occasioned by the increased presence of central Mexican goods and ideas among the Maya. It is reasonable to assume that the traditional trade route between central Mexico and the large Maya centers, a route that necessarily passed through the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, had become even more important. At this point in time, and not earlier, there was sufficient reason to make the cost of eliminating the Nephites worth the expenditure. We have the growing civilization of Teotihuacan in the right time and location, and matching the geographical description of Mormon in the Book of Mormon, and also a motive for war of all-out mass destruction of the Nephites for sole control of the Maya markets around AD 400, fitting with what Mayan scholars presume was probably the reason for Teotihuacan's control of Mesoamerica. So let's have a look at some other evidences. So there's some really fascinating convergences and connections between the destruction in 3rd Nephi and what we know about volcanic and geological activity in Mesoamerica. The account of the Great Destruction in 3rd Nephi finds remarkable parallels with what modern seismology and volcanology show about cataclysmic geological events and with historical reports of such catastrophes. Yet Joseph Smith never saw a volcano, never experienced a significant earthquake, nor is it likely he had ever read any substantial literature on the subject. But the region of Mesoamerica, particularly southern Mexico and Guatemala, where many suggest that much of the Book of Mormon story may have happened, is a place of continuing volcanic and seismic activity. So some of the convergences between the text of the Book of Mormon and what we know about volcanic activity include thick darkness for 3 days, the difficulty of lighting fires or torches, storms, sharp lightnings, earthquakes, all of which occurring and being historically recorded during volcanic eruptions, which Joseph Smith would not have had any experience of. All of these things accompany volcanic eruptions, and the darkness likely came from the thick ash and the gases in the air preventing the lighting of fire. These descriptions correlate with the things expert geologists state would accompany a volcanic eruption. Recent work by Mexican archaeologists now points to a major volcanic disaster in central Mexico during the spring of the early 1st century AD. Patricia Plunkett and Gabriela Urinuela documented a significant eruption of the Popocatépetl volcano. During that event, the site of Tatimpa was covered under a massive layer of volcanic ash. The cataclysm created a column of tephra 20 to 30 kilometers high and is believed to have caused an ecological disaster of unprecedented proportions. So geologists have pointed that there was a major volcanic disaster in that region, dating to the correct century, but they cannot give a precise year. And all the descriptions of the destruction in 3rd Nephi matches and correlates very well with the things that follow a volcanic eruption, providing plausibility that the events that happened in 3rd Nephi prior to Jesus visiting the Nephites historically occurred. Supporting this, in 3rd Nephi, the Lord speaks of sunken cities such as Oniha, Mokum, and Jerusalem. In the 1990s, Roberto Samayo noticed ruins on an underwater plateau while he was scuba diving in Lake Atitlan, located in the highlands of Guatemala. Anthropologist John Sorensen noted that the buildings appear to have been undamaged before their submersion, implying a sudden rise of the water. The sudden rise in water, which left the 30-acre island submerged under 12 to 30 meters of water, was likely due to local volcanic activity. Samabaj offers a perfect example of the type of destruction experienced by the cities of Oniha, Mokum, and Jerusalem, as explained by the voice of the Lord. Rather than sinking into the sea or having a flash flood come crashing down upon them from above, the Lord declared that the waters have I caused to come up in the stead thereof. This is exactly what happened at Samabaj. The water level of its surrounding lake quickly arose and submerged it. This underwater settlement, which until recent times lay undetected at the bottom of a popular resort lake, demonstrates that the type of flooding mentioned in 3rd Nephi is anything but far-fetched. And finally, the drought mentioned in Helaman. The drought recorded in Helaman 11 is probably the only dated climate-related event in the entire Book of Mormon that could have left a signature detectable over 2,000 years after it occurred. However, over the last 15 to 20 years, various researchers have turned to analyzing stalagmites collected from caves to reproduce the precipitation history of a given area. These analysis methods are now producing results approaching the 1-year resolution with a 95% confidence level on the order of a decade. A drought occurred just over 2,000 years ago in Mesoamerica. The drought happened within a few years of when the Book of Mormon account said it should have happened. They indicate a drought duration somewhere between 3.2 to 11.4 years, a range that includes the 3 to 3.5 year duration described in the Book of Mormon, Helaman 11. Okay, so wrapping up on these correlations and convergences between the Book of Mormon and Mesoamerican geography and culture, I like what Brent Gardner has to say. It would be nice, but less conclusive than many suspect, if there were a single piece of archaeological evidence that would provide the smoking gun demonstrating the historicity of the Book of Mormon. Even if we had that one piece of evidence, it is likely that most would find issues with it and either deny that it was a gun or that it had ever been fired. Single pieces of evidence are ultimately unsatisfying. Much stronger is the web of interlocking evidence that links together a geography, a specific time, and specific events. The best correspondences between the Book of Mormon and the known history of Mesoamerica are those occasions when place, time, and events all correspond, showing why the Book of Mormon descriptions would not have been accurate earlier or later. Getting an event at the right time in the right place is a single piece of interlocking evidence. There's currently a remarkable set of correspondences that are quite precise for time, place, and event, showing that the Book of Mormon accurately reflects the greater world in which it was written. There may not be that one conclusive evidence for Book of Mormon historicity, but there is a solid web of interlocking evidence that points to a text authentic to a specific time and place. And I would argue that these convergences and these plausible evidences that I provided, both between the text of the Book of Mormon matching old world geography descriptions and the things in the new world and with Mayan culture, this may not prove the Book of Mormon. It may not be undeniable archaeological evidence, but these correlations in geography and with culture should be taken into account and taken seriously. Certainly with more time and scholarship, this Book of Mormon does not look completely ridiculous with history and is not inconsistent with old world geography, and there's a growing body of evidence showing that it has some consistency with what we know about Mesoamerica and Mayan culture. Critics may parrot, though, that there's no definitive archaeological evidence for the Book of Mormon, so just forget about all these convergences. No non-LDS archaeologists verify it. However, what I would say is to compare the arguments and the evidence presented by faithful scholars with what archaeologists who aren't members of the church have to say. Brent Gardner, in his book, often quotes the Mayan scholarship, Mesoamerican scholars, and then shows how this correlates with the Book of Mormon. And that's also what I've tried to present in this video, showing the correlations and plausibility and convergences to support the historicity and divine origin of the Book of Mormon. Okay, so let's summarize today's video. So we discussed how there's no definitive proof for any archaeological sites in the Book of Mormon that non-LDS archaeologists like Michael Coe and the critics would state that no archaeological evidence for the Book of Mormon has been found and is therefore not historical. And it's also supported by the anachronisms that we discussed in the previous episode. There's limitations and assumptions when it comes to archaeology, such as less than 1% of archaeological sites being excavated in Mesoamerica. The assumptions that the Nephites and the Lamanites were the only people here living in the Americas, and that we should find evidence of Hebrew language, writing, and Christian iconography, and what is more likely that they would have adopted the culture and language of the surrounding peoples. We also talked about how there's issues in biblical archaeology, such as no evidence for the Exodus, how Christians can often have a double standard when it comes to the Book of Mormon. We discussed Old World geography, Lehi's travel through the Arabian desert, traveling through the incense trail, how the breaking of the bow fits with them traveling into a more arid climate, them discovering a place which was called Nahom, bearing Ishmael there, traveling eastward to Bountiful, and it all converging together. Critics might say that it's a coincidence and perhaps not definitive proof, but it converges very well together and is certainly not inconsistent with Old World Arabian geography. LIDAR technology, revealing under the jungles of Guatemala, vast cities, large populations, raised highways, agriculture, warfare, fortifications, all corresponding with descriptions in the text of the Book of Mormon. Mulek being a shortened form of Malchiah, son of the king Zedekiah, Coriantumr stone, and a famine in Helaman, matching a drought found in Mesoamerica around the same time. In the New World, we discuss convergences with Mesoamerica and Mayan culture, such as the emergence of kings among the Maya, when Nephi is king, Mosiah fleeing to Zarahemla, and the Nephites and the Mulekites not understanding each other in Zarahemla, reflecting Mayan peoples migrating in the right time and place. Other convergences include Mayan warfare, fortifications, throwing arrows, the Maquatil for Ammon slicing off arms, seasons of warfare, and the armor worn in the Book of Mormon correlates between the Book of Mormon and the Maya. Also, royal visits, paying a tribute or a tax to a higher king, and there being lesser kings under a higher king's jurisdiction, such as with Lamoni's father. We also discussed the volcanic eruptions in and around Mesoamerica, linking and matching the destruction in 3rd Nephi, such as the volcanic ash being the 3 days of darkness, storms, earthquakes, sharp lightning, sunken cities, and not being able to light a torch, converge with what we would expect to follow with volcanic eruptions, and that there is one dated in the right location in Mexico in early 1st century CE. Overall, there's no definitive archaeological proof for the Book of Mormon. My view is that there are some strong convergences both in the Old World and some growing convergences and correlations in Mesoamerica. Okay, so in summary, is there archaeological evidence to support the Book of Mormon? Again, I think it depends on how you evaluate the evidence presented and maybe on your biases as well. If you don't believe the Book of Mormon is historical, then this video may not have convinced you, and you'll probably just focus on what the non-LDS archaeologists have to say, that there's been no definitive proof or evidence. If you believe in the Book of Mormon, you'll probably find a lot of these evidences or convergences supportive and strengthening for the Book of Mormon's historicity and authenticity. For me, as both a believer but someone who tries to be open-minded to arguments for and against, I can see some plausible evidence to support things in the Book of Mormon. I don't see these convergences as this is the smoking gun that proves the Book of Mormon, but I also think these things should be taken into account in light of the criticisms and perhaps anachronisms that are pointed out against the Book of Mormon. And the Book of Mormon is starting to look less ridiculous, or at least not completely inconsistent with what we know about Old World geography and Mesoamerican geography and Mayan culture. And I think a question to those people who say that Joe Smith just made it all up and the Book of Mormon is just 19th century fiction, then how do you account for all these things which seem to correlate really well in time, place with both Old World and New World geography? Why would there be any correlations or any convergences if Joseph Smith just made it up? And just as I believe that apologists and believers, we need to confront that some of the serious arguments or criticisms against the Book of Mormon, I would also say that critics or non-believers, they need to confront some of the evidence laid forth and not just dismiss it. And it should at least be taken into consideration. Overall, I think I go back to Neil L. Maxwell's quotes from the beginning of the video. I don't think proof will be provided for the Book of Mormon. I don't think God is in the business of proving. However, I also don't believe he'll want it to look like an obvious fraud and people to believe against all reason and all evidence, but that there is plausible evidence to still maintain faith. I finish with this quote from President Gordon B. Hinckley, where he says, "The evidence for its truth," this is the Book of Mormon, "for its validity in a world that is prone to demand evidence lies not in archaeology or anthropology, though these may be helpful to some. It lies not in words. It lies not in research or historical analysis, though these may be confirmatory. The evidence for its truth and validity lies within the covers of the book itself. The test of its truth lies in reading it. It is a book of God. Reasonable people may sincerely question its origin, but those who have read it prayerfully have come to know by a power beyond their natural senses that it is true, that it contains the Word of God." Okay, so this sums up today's video, and I'll put links in the description where you can dive in deeper as well. But I've tried to cover a lot in this video. In the next video, we're going to be looking at, could Joseph Smith have created and dictated the Book of Mormon himself? We're going to be looking at Joseph's level of education and his intellect. We're going to be looking at the time frame and the mechanics for the Book of Mormon dictation. We're going to be looking at the complexity and just overall, could Joseph Smith have been able to create it himself? So that will be next episode. If you enjoyed this one, please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye. If Sorensen is correct in associating Kamanala with the city of Nephi, can't talk. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.